I'd like to welcome everybody here today. I appreciate you coming out to hear about our report. Becker, I'm the Kent County prosecutor and one of the co-chairs of the DVC. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but I want to recognize and bring up Katie Hall, the mom. Without her support and her to let us undertake this important work, it wouldn't have happened. I think she wants to say a few words before we get started. So, Katie, the podium's yours.
Thank you. I'm Dylan's mom, and I am beyond grateful for all of the work, research, and dedication that this task force has done in bringing awareness to the seriousness of domestic violence and for their recommendations to implement change. Because of them, what happened to Dylan can be used as a tool to help and address flaws in the system and potentially prevent a situation like this one from happening again. I'm here today to share some of my experiences through the system in hopes that through this I am able to help establish policies and practices that better protect the children and families of this community from any further devastation as a result of domestic violence. My goal is not to point the finger and place blame on any specific individual or agency, as Derek was ultimately responsible for Dylan's tragic death. But I'm here to bring awareness to the various lethality factors so that an informed decision can be made that best protects children and victims of abuse who are at the mercy of their decision makers. If through these changes we are able to protect and save just one child's life, then Dylan would not have died in vain. Thank you.
It is on. I don't know. I don't think we need it. I think we're okay. I'll talk nice and loud. And I think we all got loud enough voices, and they got their microphones up here. So once again, tremendous appreciation for allowing us to do this work. I mean, it's a whole experience, and I can't imagine what you're going through. But I think hopefully some good will come from this and the work that was done in developing this report. I do want to acknowledge a few other people here. I know we have Chief Kim Koster with the Wyoming Police Department. I know her department's one of the participants in the DVC CRT, and we see her quite often. We have a representative from Representative David LeGrand's office, Max Allback. He's standing back there. I really appreciate Representative LeGrand's support for victims of crime. I know he was a former Kent County prosecutor. There's a here. Multidisciplinary to this press conference here. A brown bag lunch, or time educational forum now, brown bag lunch. But it's just a way for community partners, prosecutor's office, police, Safe Haven, the CA, to kind of come community, just community members to come together about domestic violence and the issues and day. And I've said this before in many interviews. Domestic violence is one of the crimes that any prosecutor's office, be it the state, see every single day. Christmas Day, New Year's Day, the Super Bowl, whatever you have, we see a domestic violence case. And so that's why the work is so important for what we're doing. This is the first of its kind, at least in Kent County, this analysis, kind of a review of what happened and what occurred in a domestic violence homicide. I expect it will not be the last. This is a kind of a groundbreaking effort for our community. It's been done elsewhere, but I think it's very important that it's not just a one and done, because the lessons learned are somewhat for this case. But each domestic violence case is different, and there's things we need to know and understand. So I think this is something we're going to do. I don't know, once, twice. We'll see how it goes. A year, and maybe take a look and a deep dive into the domestic violence homicides, because it's one of those things that we see quite a few of in Kent County and elsewhere. So I think it's important work. Before we get to it, I'd like to introduce Sherry Thomas. She's with the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence, and she's going to give us a little bit of a statewide perspective on this.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sherry Thomas, and I'm going to try and see if we can get this mic going. So if you can give me a moment. I have a pretty good outdoor voice, but I know mics are helpful.
Let's see if it's working.
Hey. A little bit of patience. All right. So again, Cherie Thomas, Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. So one of the questions that we get often is, why doesn't she just leave? Why does she stay? Asking someone to leave a relationship in which another is exerting power and control over them is akin to asking them to stand in front of a loaded gun, pleading for the trigger to not be pulled. And when that trigger is pulled, we are called upon to respond and create things such as domestic violence fatality review boards. A necessary response measure that can also be used as a preventative tool. In the state of Michigan, there is recognition of the need for coordinated community responses between domestic violence service providers and legal systems. In our state, between 2014 and 2018, intimate partner violence and domestic violence was a known factor for 45% of all female homicide victims. It's a large number, y'all. Domestic violence fatality review boards within our state are growing. Kalamazoo, Midland, Oakland, and Wayne County are actively engaged in coordinated community response teams to review domestic violence-related homicides. When a diverse team of systemic actors come together for a common cause, the collaboration can result in a decreasing in victim blaming, greater offender accountability, and an understanding of the collective need to come together as a community. Our ultimate goal is to keep survivors from becoming domestic violence homicide victims. As a community, you all have done a lot of hard work in developing this report. The recommendations that have come from this report have the potential to be instrumental in saving lives. The Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence has a commitment to support this work at the local and the state level. The survivors of attempted domestic violence homicides, the victims of domestic violence homicides, and those who are left in the aftermath. We can't change what has been done. However, as a community, a collective, through a coordinated response, we can do our part to minimize the number of victims and reduce harms to survivors when they share their experiences with us. So let us all be the vest that prevents a domestic violence homicide so that safety can be a reality for all. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. I can hold for a second too if you need. No? Okay. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Cherie. As Chris Becker noted, I too want to thank you, Katie, for being here and for inviting the DVCCRT to engage in this process. I also want to acknowledge all survivors listening and gathered here in the room today. While the DVCCRT is hosting today's press conference, it will be the responsibility of all of us, each community member, each neighbor, each person, to work towards the recommendations we will outline in just a moment. The responsibility to reduce domestic violence is a shared community responsibility. And our systems fail when we say or demonstrate in our decision-making that victims just need to leave. Accountability cannot rest solely on their shoulders. Systemic actors have tangible steps that can be taken to create accountability. As demonstrated in this case and in countless others, it is precisely after victims leave and take the steps to permanently separate themselves from their abusers that victims and their children are often killed. Today, we acknowledge the pain and devastating reality that we as a community are experiencing in relation to the countless fatal and near-fatal domestic instances occurring in our community. This report highlights one particular domestic violence homicide of the many that we have witnessed and experienced. As such, the recommendations have relevance across the many civil and criminal domestic violence occurrences in our community. So I want to thank you for showing up today, for being here. These recommendations are the results of months of review by a multidisciplinary DVCCRT Domestic Violence Homicide Review Committee. The first recommendation is that there needs to be consistent annual training for systemic actors on the understanding of domestic violence lethality factors and the utilization of a shared evidence-based danger assessment tool when making determinations related to domestic violence cases. These trainings will increase our community's understanding and ability to better recognize the level of danger victims are in when they present to our systems. Additionally, the DVCCRT recommends implementing consistent training for systemic actors on recognizing the use and effects of coercive control, as this insidious form of abuse often does not rise to the level of criminal misconduct, but has equally dangerous ramifications for victims and their children. Second is that the recommendation to stop any existing practice of encouraging parties to enter into a mutual restraining order in lieu of a personal protection order at the onset of divorce proceedings. Mutual restraining orders do not offer the same level of protection and are contrary to legislative intent that protective orders not be made mutual. Third is the recommendation to continue supervised parenting time until the concerns underlying the supervision are genuinely addressed. The last recommendation is to implement consistent training for systemic actors on the impact of domestic violence and its impact on secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. It is well established that unaddressed secondary trauma leads to decisions that are more likely to rely on inaccurate conclusions. Today is an important opportunity for our community to listen and to learn. Naming these recommendations today is the first step of change. We as a DVCCRT, we as a community, believe that Kent County has a desire to better understand the complex dynamics of domestic violence and lethality and can learn from these tragic homicides. It's our hope that these systems can enact meaningful and lasting change to better protect domestic violence victims while holding accountable those individuals who choose to harm. At this time, we will take a few questions.
What do you do with these recommendations? I mean, do you take them to the judges or?
Yeah, I think we take it to the community, right? This is not, when we say systemic actors, we are talking about any system that victims or offenders have contact with. And so that is the courts, both civil and criminal, but it's also domestic violence agencies, it's child protective services, it's friend of the court, it's attorneys that represent clients and attorneys that represent offenders. So we take it to everyone, to answer your question.
Some may look at this as a failure of the system. How do you look at that?
I think it's, when we look at domestic violence cases and we look at homicides like this, because we know and believe that people are willing to dive deep and try to figure out what can we do different. Because to be honest, we can't afford to stay the course. People are dying. And so we as a community have to do something different.
Chris, maybe you can answer this from a legal standpoint. We talked about the number of domestic violence cases. Are you seeing a rise in cases you're prosecuting? And is the timing of this report important to that?
Yeah, especially over COVID, I think nationwide, and we saw some of the similar statistics around here. We had about a 10% increase in domestic violence cases, so that's consistent locally and across the country with everything shut in, and who knows with all the pressures that are going on right now. So I think this is very timely for that, but this is, we've gone through streaks. I mean, it seems like there's been streaks. Like last year we had like 4 in a row. The last 2, while not your traditional, as you spoke of, a female victim, we had 2 domestic-related homicides just last week. So it does happen, and it is something that's always popping up. So I think it's always a good time to take a look at what can be done better and what can we do to prevent those in the future, because they're horrible for everybody involved. And so this is a great thing. I'm very appreciative. I mean, Tara is kind of being modest. This was her, really, she put this out there and she really worked hard on it, and it was her idea. So I salute her for doing that because she was really the engine behind it.
With the systems changing that you guys are trying to do, is there any timeline? I know it's a little early, but that you're hoping to use to kind of keep these goals accountable?
Yeah, so as Chris mentioned, our DVCCRT group meets monthly, and so I think part of this is actually even creating the structure of what accountability will look like. Part of bringing this into a very public light is to actually ensure that accountability can happen, and we don't have to hold the ultimate clipboard for that. When I said we as a community have a responsibility, the community has a responsibility to make change and do action, but also hold our systemic actors accountable. And, in large part, some of that work is already underway. We have folks, here representing Child Protective Services. They have already started to dig deep and start to really tangibly think through how do we implement some of these recommendations.
Why would you encourage, the systemic actors to actually implement this change? Like you said, at the end of the day, this falls on the community actually implementing it. I guess why is it important for them to follow through?
To say it again, people are dying. To use Chris's statistics, domestic violence is not reducing. It's not declining. And when a victim makes the decision to step forward, the odds are against them. The systems aren't set up to support them in a lot of ways. And so my hope, and I think the hope of the DVCCRT, is we can use this as a tool to imagine what are those changes that we can make to better set victims and survivors up to attain safety when they make that decision to leave.
Can you kind of describe the systems in place now that go against victims when they do try to come forward? I know it's probably a lot, but
Yeah, I don't know if it's the systems that go against. It's more so this collective call to action to the systemic actors to do the work, right? To read the recommendations, reflect on the recommendations, do the hard work to make changes. And some of these are big changes, and some are simple. Stop using mutual restraining orders in lieu of a personal protection order. It's really simple, right? And then there's others that are going to take a lot of time. It's going to be training, it's going to be consistent training, so that when you all leave, we still do the work.
Maybe I can, I don't know, maybe against it, but in terms of, I think, what you spoke of, in terms of public perception, just leave. Why didn't they just leave? I think that's the public, you talk to just about John Q. Public out in the street, in terms of that seems to be the easy answer. How do they just walk out? Well, it's hard to walk out on somebody who may be the main breadwinner, who may be the father of the kids, and you rely on that person because you got to go to work and that's your babysitter. So that's part of the system, if you will, and I think to some extent in Kent County we are tremendously blessed. We do have Safe Haven, we do have the YWCA, we have some great victim advocates up here. I've assigned a victim advocate out of our office that focuses on domestic violence cases. So we are resource rich to some extent, but it's still extremely difficult for somebody in an intimate relationship to just walk out and leave, and just trying to break that and make it feel safe for them, because I don't think they understand necessarily either, because they see the barriers, if you will, and maybe don't recognize there are these agencies out here that can assist, and maybe getting the word out that there are people out there that can help them.
Have you guys talked to any of those systemic actors, local police departments, obviously the prosecutor's office, what have you guys indicated on their willingness to implement some of these changes?
Yeah, so I think the first acknowledgement is that the DVCCRT is a multidisciplinary team. And so, you had mentioned a few of those actors, and many of them do have representation on the DVCCRT, and some do not. And I think part of those next steps is, the DVCCRT is open to the public. The invitation stands for folks to join and join in this work. And I think, this is the beginning of that, maybe for some that haven't had presence at that space. And so that would be what I would, be hopeful of.
How long did this report take to put together, and why was it helpful to look at, one case in particular?
Yeah, I think, how long did it take? Well, we started this in the fall of 2021, so several months. I think we cite in the report that it was 78 contact hours, and that probably doesn't even do it justice, right? I think another reason why we did this as we named is that Katie, allowed us to bear witness to this. She allowed us to look into every aspect of her life. And so in a lot of ways, she represents the motivation to do this first of its kind report here in Kent County.
Did Caitlin come to you, or did you come to her?
Caitlin came to us.
Do you guys plan on releasing this on like a yearly basis moving forward, every 5 years or something like that? Like you mentioned, this is the first one, but do you have plans to continue this?
I don't know if I can answer that in definitive terms of like every year, every 5 years. I think, as Chris said, like this is so rich and helpful to really do that deep dive and look at, where are those opportunities to grow. And I think, Cherie said something to me a couple days ago that we'll do this work and we'll do it really well, because I believe that we will. And then more people will join and we'll be able to do it even better. And so I think we need to, right? We need to commit to doing that and continuing to improve our systems.
Would you guys also apply to like other areas of crime within Kent County?
Yeah, there's, that's the thing, is that is kind of the new trend, is there is a lot of review teams. There's the elder death review team, there's the domestic violence, there's the opioid death review team. So there's a lot of review teams going on out there. And yeah, we support them to take a look at it, but they're very work intensive. And so not only is it work intensive, but then you're taking away, it's kind of extra. So, we're supportive, but I think it's got to be managed appropriately, because you just can't spend your whole time on review teams. You got to pick and choose and try to be judicious on what you're doing for each one.
What about those mutual restraining orders? Are those common, or I don't know how, do you know?
Yeah, I think so. We know that it was present in this case, right? We know that it is a practice that we have observed happen here in this county and across the state. I think what we really want to focus on is that it goes against the legislative intent. Protection orders shouldn't be, they're not meant to be mutual. And so personal protection orders serve a purpose, and they should be used when victims, tell those systems that it isn't safe. In regards to like the lethality factors?
Yeah,
or
like all the recommendations that you put forth. Why was there that disconnect between these systemic actors and what you guys are recommending?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. We know that, for example, I'll take the lethality factor piece. There's been evidence and research, since the mid-'80s around what are those indicators, and I think the awareness that the DVCCRT steps away from is that there's been a disconnect. The research is there. We need to educate the community. We need to empower the community. And so, when we looked at this case, almost every single lethality factor, the box was checked. Caitlin had ended the relationship and was taking steps to permanently separate from Derek. Derek had access to weapons. The mutual restraining order allowed Derek to legally possess and purchase the firearms that he used to kill Dylan. She believed and told systems time and time again that Derek had intent to kill her family, Dylan. There was a history of domestic violence. Issues were brought around his mental health. He had unstable employment, sorry. So part of that is that education, that when we see these lethality factors, we as systems are being put on notice, and we need to do something about it. Okay, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.